Hello, everybody. As you know, I'm Shazia from the British Dental Action Group, and today we're going to be speaking to Victoria Collette-Jones. She's a former dentist, and now she's changed direction and she's written a book, which she kindly sent out to me, and I have been trying to read it since last night. Haven't been able to put it down, actually. So it's called Truth the Decay. How Bitcoin fixes this. So I came across Victoria on a post on the BDAG. The post was an anonymous one, and Victoria, do you want to join in here and tell me how you came across this post and what enticed you to say something?
Yes, well, obviously I'm a dentist myself, and so I've still got connections within the dental world. And it was someone else who actually pointed me to your Facebook group a while ago. Now, there are lots of groups that I'm kind of connected to, so I don't always see every post from all the groups that I'm part of, but for some reason, this one popped up on my feed. And it was about a dentist who was basically talking about how hard it was, how hard he'd been trying in the NHS in order to do the right thing, and how it wasn't working for him. And my heart went out to him, really, because as a dentist myself, I can really empathize with the position that a lot of my colleagues are in. In many respects, from when I was a young dentist, these were issues that I struggled with, that I had to kind of figure out how to work through them. And in many respects, my career is a story of kind of negotiating some of those obstacles, because like many of us, when we're young, before we go to university, we have an idea in our heads of what doing that job might be like. We might see impressive dentists in our social circles or in the media that we think, they look like they have a nice life. Maybe I can follow that. And of course, you don't really realize it. And then before you know it, especially as a young dentist, you're stuck in a situation that seems particularly horrible. And you then feel really disillusioned. It's like, how did I end up here? And why is what I thought in my head nothing like the reality that I'm now living? And so, yeah, I saw this post and my heart just went out to this poor guy who's clearly been trying his best for a long period of time. And I could really empathize with his position. For myself, I was a bit like the frog in boiling water. As soon as I qualified and I ended up in that situation, I was straight out again, because it was just like, this does not fit my idea of what working as a dentist was like. But of course, not everyone has the resources, the skills, the knowledge, the courage to take that kind of action, especially at an early stage in your career. And of course, the longer you stay where you are, the more familiar that becomes. And so the change becomes more difficult and harder to extricate yourself from. Now, it just so happens that, as part of my new direction away from dentistry, I'm now interested in Bitcoin and what's happening in the blockchain space. And as a result, I have my own website called satoshispage.com. And I'd recently written a newsletter, because I do that from time to time, specifically focused on Bitcoin and government. And so the best way I felt that I could respond to this particular post was to share that newsletter, because the introduction is specifically related to things that I learned as a dentist and how that taught me what was actually going on in the wider financial system. Because when we find ourselves in these horrible situations, the easiest thing to do is blame ourselves and feel like it's something we're doing wrong, or that we've missed something, or that we're inadequate in some way. And in many respects, the system sets us up to believe that as well. And I spent 20 years as a dentist, constantly going, don't want to go here, I'm going to go that way. Don't want to go here, going to go that way. Until eventually I realized that actually this whole thing is set up on a much bigger scale in order to hold us back and hinder us from reaching our ambitions. And so the longer I tried to kind of overcome those obstacles and go in a new direction, the more I learned and more I came across the next obstacle, more I came across the next obstacle, until I'm now where I am. And of course, you know, that gives me the opportunity to kind of look back and maybe, you know, guide some of not just my younger colleagues who are dentists, but colleagues who are in the other professions who remarkably are finding themselves in a similar situation. You know, when I was actually a dentist, finally in my own little private practice, you know, I would attract clients from other professions, judges, policemen, you know, lawyers, and they will all tell you the same story of how things are breaking down within their own professions. And when you realize that there's a common theme here, you think there must be something bigger going on.
The picture mentioned.
Yeah, exactly.
Ad on Facebook. On that note, I just wanted to say the person that actually got in touch with us, the anonymous post, it's actually a she.
Okay.
And you know what, the group was set up to help people like this who are trying to work in a system and do the right thing, follow the rules,
yeah,
and make a living out of it. And when on that particular post, she speaks about, I'm trying my best, but I'm not being able to make ends meet. And you know, I couldn't put your book down last night. I had only 1 hour before bed and 2 hours this morning. So I managed 99% of it. And this bit here, I wanted to read, just because there's paragraphs you've written in the book that completely relate to me. And I thought to myself, how many other people could relate to this? And so you say, by centralizing the system, the government has stolen from trained professionals the opportunity to provide the services they know are likely to be best for their clients, and the ability of the professionals to challenge the thinking of the authorities and reimagine new care solutions based on their experience. And from this paragraph, you know, what you say, they have actually stolen from us our skills. And in the last, I mean, I don't know if you were in the NHS UDA system at all.
briefly.
Very briefly. Okay, so that just explains it all. So you, the penny dropped for you much earlier than it has for us. Here we are trying to upskill, trying to invest in courses and provide the best for our patients. Yet the list of what we can provide has been reduced to 3 bands, or 4, shall I say, with the urgent one. And you feel so restricted. And I, especially with the pandemic, I found myself absolutely boiling that frog in that boiling water again, with all the PPE as well. And so I recently just cut down to 2.5 days because I can't stay in PPE in a high needs area. I just can't do it anymore. And I've just finished my master's in advanced general dental practice, and I've had to reflect and think, why did I spend so much money investing in this advanced master's in dentistry when the NHS is only giving me a limited list of treatments I can provide? So I'm reflecting right now. And when I came across your post and read the book, and for me, you've just shone the light in the right direction for me. And I hope people will buy your book and read and get to know what the bigger picture is. And so going back to, let's start with your journey. I mean, so you worked in the NHS, and then tell us a little bit about why you ended up leaving dentistry.
So I did have periods working in the NHS. I was kind of conditioned to see it differently, even when I was at university. I mean, I went, even though when I went to university, it was still possible for the government was still paying the school fees. I still had to pay for the accommodation fees and things like that myself. So for a 5-year course, that was still quite a long period of time. And so I went to university with not much financial support behind me, and I was acutely aware that I needed to get a return on that investment once I qualified, because apart from anything else, you know, I had this burden of debt that I needed to clear. And of course, for a lot of students these days, that problem is even more acute. So And even then, I mean, I went to university in 1992, and that was the point at which the government had recently decided that they were going to cut the funding to dentistry. At the time, they still had a fee per item system going, whereas if you provided a certain treatment, you would be paid a certain fee, and then they cut all those fees in 1992. So, you know, this gave dentistry quite a bad reputation for new graduates at that time. But then in the course of my studies, of course, a lot of that was evolving. And by the time I graduated, you know, private practices who kind of said, this is impossible, even from that stage, you know, were starting to move away from the system. And so this has been a gradual process over the last 20 years. And there's a lot of controversy about it. I mean, a lot of people go into the NHS because they chose the career, because they wanted to help people, and they have a trust in the system that it's been set up in a certain way, so that, you know, it will meet everybody's needs. And apart from anything else in the media, people are taught to worship the NHS. So, you know, the NHS has got this really strong brand. I mean, even now in the current pandemic, you know, the main reason for doing anything related to the pandemic is to try and help manage whatever's going on in NHS hospitals. You know, all other considerations are kind of thrown to the side based on having to save the NHS. And this narrative, I think, is particularly toxic because, of course, the NHS has been struggling for an awfully long time. Part of the problem is that, you know, when you create a service that's free at the point of demand, the first thing you do in economics, they call it a supply and demand curve. So normally the demand for a service is measured by you know, what it costs to provide, and normally that's affected by what the public are willing to pay for. But of course, with everything being in the NHS, that's completely disguised. You know, all anyone knows is, you know, what they're paying for the service. And of course, NHS dentistry is heavily subsidized. And so there's this inaccurate feedback loop where people think that, you know, what they're paying for a service reflects the quality of what they're getting, when of course, if it's being heavily subsidized by the government, you know, the reason for doing that is to try and make it more affordable for people. But what you're starting to do is you're distorting the messages in the free market so that people, okay, they can access it for cheaper, but they're also being taught over a long period of time not to value it either, which I think is a big part of the problem that a lot of us as dentists have to handle.
We bear the brunt of that. So
exactly.
We as a profession are trying to teach our patients to respect their oral cavity, and now on the NHS system where everything is practically free for them, they are not valuing the service.
Exactly. And it's a big problem in healthcare. It's a big problem in healthcare. I mean, in the short periods of time when I was working in the NHS, you know, the number of people who seemed to have this attitude that it was my job to make sure that their teeth were okay because the government were funding it. And of course, all of us know that any part of healthcare is about individuals taking responsibility for their own care. And of course, that's influenced by the resources they have as individuals. And so what happens is, as their resources of individuals deplete, they kind of cling on to this individual who supposedly is going to solve all of their problems. And then, of course, it creates this backlash of anger when you can't do that, especially when they've delegated all the responsibility onto you and they've been conditioned to believe that they don't have responsibility for it themselves. And not only that, then they have this entitled attitude, you know, the government's providing this service, I'm entitled to it. I mean, it creates a really toxic environment, which doesn't serve anybody.
It's not serving us for sure. And, you know, pre-pandemic, we would just grin and bear it and quietly get on with the job, put our heads down and do the job. And, you know, but now we have to think about putting our PPE on just for a simple scale. And when patients come in with the entitled attitude of, where's my scale and polish? I'm entitled to it for my, what is it, £22. You know, now you have to go by the rules strictly and explain to them the whole paragraph in the NHS rules that we can only provide it if it's clinically necessary. And so, you know, it's just made it so much harder. And in the chapter on the NHS, chapter 9 in your book, you write a paragraph about natural laws. Natural laws are known by the heart, but man-made laws are processed by the head. As the head decisions increasingly diverge from the heart decisions, human beings become confused. Faced with the threat of an authority figure, they will ignore the heart entirely. And so this is the paragraph that hit home as well. And these posts that are coming through on the BDAG, it's when the head and the heart are conflicting. You're trying to do the right thing because you've always done it. But now your health has come into play, because not a lot of us can survive in these conditions in the pandemic with all this extra PPE, and especially during the summer, the heat. The anger from the patients because there are long waiting lists, the limited payment to associates, some that haven't even been paid. So the penny has dropped, and a lot of us are now questioning, what are we doing here? And so when you spoke about the bigger picture, tell us what you think the bigger picture is, or am I going too far ahead, and we've got a lot more to talk about before that?
Well, it's difficult because there are many approaches to this argument, and I think the thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is literally what I wrote in my last newsletter, which is that, you know, in Christian culture, you have the 10 commandments, and then of course that got boiled down by Jesus in the Bible to, you know, love your neighbor as yourself. But of course, now we find ourselves in a situation where it's no longer love your neighbor as yourself, but love your neighbor more than yourself. And if you go back to the GDC guidelines that we're all directed to work under, and this has been in place for a long time. And the thing is, it affects us at very subtle levels. And most people don't really stand back and examine this in a closer way. And actually, if you look at the GDC guidelines, I mean, originally the oath that a doctor would take on qualifying was set up by Hippocrates. And basically the philosophy of Hippocrates was the fact that, you know, you would always do what was in your patient's best interests. And so it was about focusing on making sure that you did the best for your patients. But it's almost like some dentists decided that they were going to go one better and set up the rules so that you must always put the patient's interest before yourself. And not only that, you had to do it at the expense of any organization, you know, anyone who said anything else. I mean, the exact quote I put in my newsletter. And the reason this struck me, I mean, the thing is, even though, you know, I'd spent a number of years working in dentistry and I was kind of aware of this, it had never really hit home the extent to which this was controlling my life. And the episode that actually highlighted it for me was when I was studying for an MBA and I was actually interviewing dentists at the local emergency service. So I'd just turn up there in the evening and interview whoever was available. And because they had to work there that evening and they didn't have a lot of time on their hands, there was no way for them to escape. So I managed to get a broad range of people. And I remember interviewing this one guy who clearly did not want to speak to me at all. I think he must have thought I was a spy from the GDC, especially the nature of the questions I was asking. But, you know, basically I was trying to fish out, you know, those situations where, you know, a dentist had decided to end the relationship they had with the client. You know, it's quite a controversial topic to look at, but of course, you know, these relationships are very sensitive and they're much more intimate than a standard business. So I felt that it was an interesting thing to explore. And this particular dentist was telling me how, you know, it took a while, but eventually he admitted there was one patient he might have considered not seeing again. And this was a patient who'd lifted some money from the reception desk on the way out the door. And I said, okay, that's interesting. So, but even once he admitted that, he was then quick to qualify that by saying, but if he came back and needed treatment, I would still see him. And inside of my head, I was going, what? But didn't want to say that to him directly. But I was like, well, could you elaborate on that? You know, why would you still be prepared to see this patient? I mean, you know, if you went into a car showroom and walked out with a car, you wouldn't expect that car showroom to you know, do business with you again.
We've been conditioned to put
Well, I eventually figured out it came back down to this basic rule. We're being conditioned to sacrifice ourselves for everybody else's needs but our own. And ultimately, even if you're on an aeroplane, if they the first thing they tell you in the safety briefing is, if anything happens, make sure you put your own oxygen mask on first before you look after anybody else's. Whereas in the NHS, it's like we're taught to put a mask on everybody else until we put on our own.
What ourselves. And then they wonder why dentists have the highest suicide rate.
Exactly.
And it has really taken the pandemic to discuss this taboo subject.
Yeah.
And I think more and more people have found value within their lives. We are now valuing ourselves and putting ourselves forward. And maybe it's just that I've created a great group and people are actually able to anonymously come out and talk about their fears.
Well, I think you've met a great need. I think people are desperate. They're crying out inside. They have been for a long time. This is a process that has occurred over a long period of time. And of course, the longer you're in it, the harder it is to see. And it takes a lot of time and thought to kind of step back from the situation and go, what exactly has gone wrong here before you start to figure it out. And some of these things are really subtle. That law in the GDC guideline has been there for years, and hardly anyone discusses it or challenges it. And even if you start a discussion with other dentists, it's like there's blinders on. They don't understand it. It's just they just take it for granted. This is the way I have to behave. Not everybody does. I think some people automatically just kind of see beyond it. But clearly, as demonstrated by this dentist that I interviewed, some people really take it to heart. I mean, for me, I was shocked when I interviewed this dentist. It never occurred to me in a million years that someone would take that to heart to the degree that he did. And that's what really made me think about it. And it was just like, why do I automatically see this so completely differently than he does? And it's almost like these internal beliefs operate us on a much deeper level than we're initially able to acknowledge. It really takes some digging to figure out that actually that's the root of the problem. And if I didn't believe this, how would my life be completely different?
And so tell me about your interest in Bitcoin. How did you decide from dentistry, I'm going to now look into the world of crypto? How did you lead yourself to that path?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I'd worked, very quickly, as I said in the beginning, I decided the NHS wasn't for me. So I escaped into the private sector. But then working in the private sector, I worked for a small family private practice. I also worked for a number of the corporates who were trying to do it on a larger scale. I also studied for a business degree, because one of the things I recognized with the NHS is that system itself appears to be unfavorable to the workers and ultimately also to the patients, because again, with such an intimate service, if it's not serving the dentist, it's not going to serve the patients, because you constantly accessing workers who are perpetually burnt out. So I realized that there was something wrong with the system. So then I worked in private practice, but even working in private practice, there were issues there as well. And often it came down to the way in which the practice was managed. So that's what led me to do an MBA, because I wanted to understand that at a better level. So that helped me to understand, how to manage a business better. And by the time I graduated from my MBA, I felt like, right, I've been in dentistry for 10 years. I've experienced a number of different working environments. I want to coalesce everything that I've learned and try and set up my own business so that I can operate it in the way that I think it should be operated. And of course, I was coming at this journey from the perspective of an associate, an experienced associate, and one that had done well. But I didn't want to buy an existing practice, because having worked in a number of different locations, I could see some of the historical precedents that were really difficult to unwind if you took over an existing practice. It is possible to do it, but it takes place over a longer period of time. I wanted to start with a complete fresh slate. And because apart from anything else, one of our biggest obstacles is how long we're given to actually assess a patient in the first place. In the NHS, it's literally 5 minutes. Even even in private practice, you're lucky if you get 20 minutes. Whereas, if you do some of these advanced courses and you realize all of the different factors that you're trying to put together when you're assessing a patient, you realize that often you need a lot longer. So one of the first things I wanted to do in my own practice was to set up a series of consultations. So I'd kind of have a quick consultation for emergency treatments, or if people just wanted Botox or something, but then I'd have a standard longer consultation for people who were generally well maintained, and so that was normally the door for everybody to come in. And then often you'd be able to sift out the people who didn't really have much of a problem, but for the people who had more extensive problems, I then had a larger consultation that I'd get them to come back, where I could kind of take on board all of this additional information that I needed to in order to treat them in the way that I felt they needed to be treated. And so that was a very basic first step, because even in a private practice, if you ask a private practice to allow you an hour for a consultation when they're not used to doing that, they're up in arms and they're like, well, why do you need to do? I mean, some people are more amenable to it, but I hadn't worked anywhere where they were. And so that was one of the first things that I wanted to give myself the freedom to do, because I felt that, and also the other thing was, because I started my practice right from scratch with no NHS contract, I would attract a lot of patients who had problems that no one else could fix. So here I was in an environment where I was trying to solve all these problems, but in order to do that, because I was attracting people who had more complicated problems, I needed more information in order to treat them effectively. And in many respects, even though I'd done a number of advanced courses, just going through that process made me realize how limited my clinical expertise was, because I'd get all this information and I'd go, I don't know what to do with all of this. I understand this bit and I understand this bit, but I don't understand this bit. And so just working in that environment really developed my clinical skills as well, because apart from anything else, I'd created an environment where I could explore some of those issues. Whereas in an NHS practice, or even a private practice that had evolved from an NHS practice, my ability to do that was really limited. So, I did that, and I ran my own business for 10 years, and it taught me an awful lot, but financially it was incredibly stressful. I started the business in 2007 with these ideas, and I had my basic business plan. I knew how to do that. I had some savings, but I realized that my limitations were that I didn't have the resources to start a big business from scratch. And because I was trying to start a small thing and develop my own protocols, I could only really start with one room. So I needed to be within another business. I also realized that my skills at marketing were quite limited. So I partnered up with quite a smart hairdressing salon in the centre of Nottingham, because the idea was that I could maybe, gather some of their clients and we could kind of share marketing strategies and things like that. So that's how I started. And that in itself was a new idea as a business model as well. So, and I think all things being well, that would have worked. But the other problem I had was that in the process of organising the lease, I unexpectedly found that I was pregnant. And also, which meant that I ended up giving birth to my daughter about a month after I opened. So that dispersed my energy. And also 9 months into operating this practice as well was the financial crisis. So I'd started off with a small pot of money. Most of my equipment and my materials, I'd either got loans or leases for them, thinking that, once I built up, it would be easy to pay them back. But of course, the financial crisis not only limited my access to funding, but it also slowed down how quickly I was able to build the business. And also with having the baby, that was an additional distraction as well. So, eventually I ended up with a business coach, and he said to me, you've done it the hardest possible way any dentist could possibly do this. I had my reasons and I understand why I wanted to do it that way, but the timing was off, and I ended up with all of these additional obstacles at the same time, which made it really difficult. And there were 2 other practices that tried setting up at the same time as me. And 10 years later, I was the only one that survived. And I think the only reason for that was because I'd started off really small. And also, in spite of the fact that, come September 2008, when my personal savings had kind of reached their limit, and I had to go to the bank for funding, literally no bank on the planet was giving money to anybody. Now, for me, that was a real wake-up call because, you know, the whole time I was a dentist, I'd never had a problem with that. I mean, I remember going to my university interviews and talking to the students. They were like, oh, the banks love you, never have any problem borrowing any money. And as a student, I didn't. I mean, I graduated 60 grand in debt to help, you know, pay for my living expenses and things like that as well. I had no problem getting money from the banks as a student. And, you know, even throughout my professional career, if I'd ever needed money, no problem. And by the end of 2007, you know, people were throwing credit cards at me. You know, I'd never had a credit card before, but, you know, luckily at that point in time, I was starting to experiment with them. So, you know, I applied for a bunch and they gave me a bunch as well. And ultimately, that's the only thing that saved my business because I'd kept it small, I was able to pay some of the business expenses with my credit card. I mean, even the hairdressers let me pay my rent with one of my credit cards at one point when I was really struggling. And so, you know, that's what ended up keeping the wheel going. But even so, there were weeks, if something had gone wrong with a particular patient's treatment and they hadn't been able to pay me, I would have been bankrupt the next week because I'd reached the limit of all of my credit cards. And literally, I had nowhere else to get some cash for the next bill that needed paying. So it was incredibly stressful. And it didn't last forever. It was about 2.5 years. And I kept going because by then I'd built my bridges. I didn't know where to go instead. So I just kind of kept going with what I did. And eventually I got to the end of it. But when I did get to the end of it, I was like, what the hell happened there? And so that was the point at which I really started to explore it. And the main motivation was because, you know, once I got beyond that, because the other problem was I had a house that I'd renovated to really high standards. So I needed to sell it for a particular amount of money. But again, I put it on the market in the summer of 2007, was probably overpriced because by then house prices were being valued stupidly. Anyway, it eventually took me 7 years to sell this house for the price I needed to sell it for. So that was another obstacle. I couldn't, you know, that would have been a source of funds that I wasn't able to access. So when I finally got past the danger zone in my business and I finally got to the stage where I sold my house, I finally had some money. And not only that, it was really precious to me because I'd been without it for so long. And so that's when I really started to think about, you know, where's the best place for me to put this money. So it started from self-interest, you know, looking for, you know, how to store my money safely, you know, what was sound money, that kind of thing. But in the process of that exploration, I just lifted the lid on the whole can of worms of what was going on in the financial system. And once I did, so many things clicked into place, including, you know, why my career up until that point has been so hard. And also the other thing was, by that time, I did have a business coach, and my initial plan had been to start small and then move to a bigger location. And so I was reaching the point where, you know, my small practice was finally becoming saturated. I'd built it up enough and it was getting to the stage where I was going to look for a larger location. So my business coach got me to put together a business plan. But in the process of doing that business plan, I realized it was just going to be 10 more years of pain. And I was like, I do not enjoy it enough to go through that again. It's like, there's no way. But of course, by then, oh, sorry, did you want to say something?
I want to just say, I mean, you started out with a passion for change.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of us are in that boat at the moment. So many have jumped ship and have opened up squats at the moment. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them keep a job going to keep afloat. Mm-hmm. That's a good way of doing it, having some regular income and perhaps building up in evenings, weekends, and slowly reducing the days in your other practice. So you're not saying that it's a total bad idea to start off with loans, or if you've got the cash, if people have got the cash to start their squats and buy everything outright, then would you say, if you didn't have all these loans, etc., had your own property, would your 10 years have been different?
Certainly I did it harder than you could have, and you know, that was a possibility of kind of continuing to work part-time in another place and start up my own as well. The other factor in my case was I'd recently had a baby. So even though I was working part-time in my own business, the other thing that was focusing my attention was, you know, this child that I was looking after. But apart from that, I mean, I'd worked for 3 different corporates building a list from scratch. So I knew I could do it, and I had a good idea of what the time scale would be. And if everything had kind of gone to plan, that would have been fine. And that was what my business plan was based on. But I think especially because I'd set up a private practice, I think that trajectory was slowed down because of the private practice, because of the financial crisis, because even people who are wealthy were affected by that, all of their stocks and things, everyone was kind of taking a step back and trying to regroup. At the time, some of the people who were providing me services would allow me to pay my invoices a month later. Now they were demanding that I paid them straight away, because especially when you're a new business and you haven't established your reputation, people judge you differently. So that makes it harder as well. So there are lots of other things that you wouldn't think about that make it harder, that you wouldn't necessarily have anticipated. And those were all the learning curves. Those are things that you don't really learn as an associate. You only really learn once you're actually dealing with those back end issues yourself. And it is, it's definitely an extra skill set. I definitely wouldn't encourage someone who's just a good associate to go off and start their own practice without really seriously considering it. And also, although I eventually got a business coach 5 years in, my life would have been a hell of a lot easier if I'd got them on board the moment I was planning it, because they know the questions to ask you that you hadn't necessarily thought about yourself.
The hard way.
Yeah, and often they're dealing with other clients as well. So even though these were my issues 10 years ago, a business coach is currently dealing with a number of other clients, will be aware of what their issues are. And so in many respects, they can see 2 or 3 years ahead of you, and can help you identify what some of your stumbling blocks would be. So from my perspective, that would have been a huge investment, because if I look at my turnover for the first 5 years and then the 5 years after I got a business coach, I was just like, my life would have been so much easier. But the thing is, I had a business degree. I thought I knew everything that I needed to do. I was widely experienced. I really felt that I'd thought through the issues, but there were certain things that I hadn't considered at all. And even if I'd wanted to continue doing it for the reasons that I wanted to, the business coach would have just helped me get certain things on board, which just would have made my journey easier and more productive and smoother. Because when you run a business, there are so many places that you can put your attention, especially in dentistry. You've got to think about the clinical issues, then you've got the financial issues, you've got the equipment issues. Equipment breaking down was a huge headache, because as an associate, if the equipment breaks down, you can have a day off and your boss gets to sort it out. But if you're running the business, if you're not working, you can't pay the bills either. So it's a double whammy. Negotiating with suppliers, making sure they're available, because if I was working in a small room, if something happened to my sterilizer, and of course, in 2008, when I set up, 2 years later, it was demanded that everyone had washer disinfectors. Within a year, they realized they were all breaking down. But, 10 grand that wretched machine cost me. That's an expense I didn't need right at the beginning of my journey. And so, someone who's more experienced in some of the things that will slow you down or will really, really trip you up, someone to point out those things to you, I think is really worth the investment in that expertise is so invaluable.
So we need to interview some business coaches for the group.
Absolutely,
as well.
absolutely. Because, I can give you the perspective 10 years on, and I'm moving even beyond dentistry, but there are still plenty of people who are stuck in that mindset, who can probably give you some valuable insights. And yeah, definitely.
But for you, so it was, I think every single dentist, from student to where you are right now, we feel we need to go through that dentist cycle. Student, associate, owner, and then whatever next.
Exactly. And that's the problem, because I got to the stage where I was like, this is hell. What the hell am I doing this for? And it's like, what do you do next? And I was even talking to my financial advisor going, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. I said, what are you going to do instead? And it was like, I don't know. I don't know.
That concludes part 1.
Okay. All right then.